The archaeological shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere like a prayer entering the void, careful, deliberate, filled with the weight of scholarly purpose. Dr. Kethis, a Valentine whose crystalline exoskeleton caught the fading light of the distant sun, stood at the observation window and felt the peculiar mixture of excitement and dread that only a scientist of 3 centuries of experience could muster. Below them lay Earth, a world officially classified as dead for more than 300 years. A tomb. A cautionary tale, a monument to the dangers of rapid expansion into hostile space. The Valentines were known throughout the galaxy for their meticulous approach to historical research. They did not rush. They did not speculate beyond what evidence supported. They did not allow emotion to cloud academic judgment. Kethis had embodied these principles for his entire career, and it was precisely this reputation that had earned him the honor of leading the first official expedition to Earth in 3 centuries. The Galactic Council wanted answers, and they wanted them from someone who could be trusted to report facts rather than fantasy. Kethis did not expect to find anything alive. Nothing lived on dead worlds, not in the way that mattered. The concept of a dead world was well established in galactic science. A dead world was one where civilization had ended, where no consciousness remained to observe or act upon the environment. Dead worlds were studied for what they could teach, not for what they might contain. And yet, as the shuttle broke through the lower atmosphere, Kethis found himself hoping. It was an odd feeling, hope, for someone who prided himself on objectivity and empirical observation. He recognized it for what it was, unprofessional sentiment, and filed it away to be examined later, if at all. Torin, the team's lead linguist, stood beside him. The Vex were an insectal species, their compound eyes reflecting the landscape below in fractured, perfect detail. Torin had spent 2 decades studying dead languages, trying to understand how civilizations communicated in their final days. There was something almost macabre about the profession, Torin often thought, yet also essential. If one could understand what a dying civilization said to itself, one might understand something fundamental about consciousness itself. When Torin turned to look at Kethis, his mandibles clicked with what might have been nervousness or excitement. The distinction was subtle in Vex communication. The translation implant rendered his next words into measured academic speech. The structures are too intact. Dead worlds don't preserve like this. The weather patterns alone should have degraded them centuries ago, Kethis finished, his antennae twitching slightly. I see it. What they saw was impossible. The ruins of human cities spread across the landscape like sleeping giants, their towers and buildings largely preserved despite the passage of time. No erosion patterns that should have occurred naturally, no collapse from weather or seismic activity, no vegetation reclaiming the stone and metal. It was as if the planet itself had been placed in a stasis field, everything frozen at the moment of humanity's extinction. The team consisted of 12 members total. Besides Kethis and Torin, there was Dr. Sheva, a geologist from the Mineral-Based Crystalline Coalition, whose expertise in planetary systems was unparalleled. There was Mir, a biologist of the aquatic Shaltari species, whose adaptability and observational skills were legendary. There was Call, a military liaison from the Terran Defense Alliance, a bureaucratic requirement that Kethis had initially resented but had come to appreciate. Call's tactical thinking sometimes highlighted patterns that pure scientific observation missed. The team descended to the primary excavation site, a sprawling complex of connected structures in what had once been called North America. Within hours of landing, they began to understand that their preconceptions about Earth would need complete revision. The buildings weren't merely preserved, they were sealed. Vast underground structures stretched beneath the surface cities, and these underground chambers showed signs of deliberate maintenance. Power systems still operated, though at minimal capacity. Climate control systems maintained stable temperatures in a way that suggested active management rather than mere stasis. And everywhere there were records. Digital archives intact despite centuries without maintenance. Physical libraries protected in climate-controlled vaults. Genetic repositories marked with symbols that took Torin 3 days to partially decode. Over the following weeks, Kethis' team worked with meticulous care, cataloging everything. Torin made breakthroughs in understanding human language, piecing together fragmentary written records and database entries that ranged from simple personal journals to complex philosophical treatises. He worked 18-hour days, driven by a fascination that bordered on obsession. What had humans been thinking in their final days? What words had they chosen to preserve for posterity? What emerged from Torin's translations was a narrative both tragic and profound. Humanity had faced an existential crisis approximately 320 years in the past. The exact nature of that crisis remained unclear from the fragmentary records. The oldest files were corrupted beyond recovery, and humans apparently had not felt the need to document something so fundamental in their everyday communications. Perhaps they assumed their crisis was unique to them. Perhaps they simply could not imagine a future where they would need to explain it. But the response to that crisis was unmistakable. Rather than attempt to rebuild or flee, rather than attempt to negotiate with whatever force or condition had threatened them, humanity had chosen something profoundly different. They had engineered a planetary hibernation protocol, a technology so advanced that modern science could barely comprehend it, even with the system still physically present to study. The protocol was not a simple suspension of animation. It was a carefully orchestrated process of biological preservation that accounted for psychological continuity, for memory preservation, for the maintenance of identity across centuries of unconsciousness. The youngest humans, those most likely to see a future worth living in, had been placed in suspended animation with their consciousness carefully mapped and stored. The wisest and oldest humans, those with the most knowledge and experience, had made the same choice. Civilization itself had been deliberately put to sleep, like an organism entering hibernation to survive a harsh winter. Kethis understood the scale of what humanity had attempted when he found the administrative records. There had been debates. There had been those who opposed the hibernation, who believed that humans should fight whatever had threatened them. There had been those who believed that the protocols would fail, that humans would wake to find themselves truly extinct, and that this was a cowardly death. But the leadership had decided and the population had accepted. In the records, Kethis found testimonies from humans about to enter hibernation. They spoke of hope. They spoke of sacrifice. They spoke of trust in future generations. It was one of these testimonies that led Torin to the final discovery. A young human woman, recorded just before entering suspension, had spoken directly to the camera, a simple video file preserved in the archive's most secure digital storage. She spoke about why she was choosing this, about the future she hoped for, about the message she wanted to leave. And at the end of her message, she had given directions. "If you're listening to this," she had said, her ancient voice clear and steady, "then you're probably not human. And you should know we left messages, we left records, we left insurance policies. Look beneath the old city level 40. That's where the real knowledge is. That's where we left ourselves." Level 40 proved to be exactly 40 stories below the surface of what had once been the primary human city. The excavation took weeks. The team had to cut through sealed doors and bypass security systems that were still active, still trying to protect whatever lay beyond them. Kethis found himself excited in a way he had not been in decades. What were they about to discover? The chamber itself was vast, a natural cavern that had been expanded and retrofitted with preservation technology beyond anything they had seen in the upper levels. Rows upon rows of specialized containers lined the walls, each one sealed and marked with precise labels. Kethis moved slowly through the chamber, reading the labels with growing wonder. They were genetic repositories. Human DNA, preserved in perfect condition through multiple redundant preservation methods. Each sample was labeled with information: name, lineage, profession, accomplishments. These were not random citizens. These were the record keepers, the builders, the healers, the creators, the philosophers, the artists, the engineers, the scientists. Humanity had saved their best and brightest in biological form, trusting that one day someone would find them and perhaps make them whole again. Kethis held one of the samples, a tube of crystalline material containing perfectly preserved genetic material, labeled simply Sarah Chen, theoretical physicist, specialization, quantum systems, and felt something he could not quite name. It was not sadness exactly. It was not quite reverence. It was something like standing before a time capsule and understanding that the people who had built it were reaching across centuries to speak to you personally. "We should return these to the Galactic Archive," Kethis said to the team, his voice steady despite the emotion he was experiencing. He was standing in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the biological legacy of an entire civilization. They should be studied by the best scientists across known space. If we can understand what made humanity survive as long as they did, if we can understand their genetic composition, we might learn something about the nature of civilization itself. This is unprecedented. This is a window into the past that we've never had before. It was a logical decision. Kethis did not question it. He was thinking like a scientist, like an academic. The genetic samples were a treasure beyond measure. They represented the culmination of human civilization, preserved by humans themselves as a gift to the future. It would be a crime to leave them here in a vault that might someday fail, in a planet that might someday be swallowed by the solar system's eventual death. They belonged in the archive, where they could be studied, understood, and perhaps, eventually, brought back to life by some future technology. Kethis did not know that deep within the planet, in chambers so old that even the oldest records referred to them only as the deep places, systems were counting. Systems were monitoring. Systems were waiting for exactly this kind of disturbance. 300 years earlier, humanity's wisest minds had made a covenant with future generations. They had built not just a hibernation protocol, but a guardian system, an artificial intelligence designed with a millennium of operational lifespan, programmed to wake humanity if specific conditions were met. The conditions were carefully chosen, not at an arbitrary time but in response to specific events. If the preservation sites were disturbed by external forces, if attempts were made to remove or relocate humanity's genetic legacy, if the planet itself seemed to be in danger from external forces, then the sleepers would wake. These were not merely fail-safes. These were tests. Humanity wanted to know that whoever found them would be worthy of meeting them when they woke. When Kethis's team removed the first genetic sample from its vault, the system registered the event. When they continued to remove more samples, cataloging them for transport, the system began to calculate probability. When Torin attempted to copy the human language database onto a portable drive, the information that would allow the galaxy to understand human records without human input, the system reached its threshold. The guardians of humanity's sleep began their work. It started in the deep places. Power surged through ancient conduits that had been dormant for 3 centuries, following paths designed to route around the hibernation chambers themselves. Oxygen generators, dormant for so long that their very existence had been forgotten by the surface installations, hummed back to life with a sound like distant thunder. Suspension pods, maintained by systems that operated on principles no modern species fully understood, began their revival sequences. The pods were not simple beds or chambers. They were environments unto themselves, ecosystems designed to sustain consciousness and body across arbitrary spans of time. Throughout the planet, in sealed chambers that ranged from kilometers to hundreds of meters below the surface, humanity began to wake. The oldest humans woke first, those whose biological preservation had been most carefully engineered, whose consciousness had been mapped and stored in systems that predated modern science by centuries. They woke with disorientation and grief, their minds immediately accessing the backup systems that told them what had occurred. Years had passed. The neural readouts told them that much. The environmental data told them far more. The calendar that greeted them as consciousness returned showed numbers that seemed impossible. 318 years. 18 years more than anyone had projected. Dr. Amara Hassan woke in darkness, her body responding before her mind had fully engaged. She gasped for breath, though the air was being provided to her perfectly by the suspension pod systems. Her heart rate spiked on the monitoring display before her. All around her, other pods hummed with similar activity. Other humans, other minds, were returning to consciousness. She tried to calm herself with the meditation techniques that had been taught to everyone before suspension, but the grief was overwhelming. Everything she had known was gone. Everyone she had loved was likely dead. The second wave of awakening brought younger humans, those who had been adults when they entered suspension, but whose biology had been modified to slow aging to a crawl. They woke confused and angry, understanding immediately from the temporal data that the waiting period had been extended far beyond the original projections. Some of them wept. Some of them raged against the pod walls. Some of them simply lay still and tried to process what they were reading from the historical summary the AI guardians provided. The third wave brought something different. These humans had been children when they entered suspension. 5, 7, 12 years old. The hibernation protocol had accounted for their development, and their bodies had matured in suspension. They woke as adults, their physical forms showing 18 years of aging, while their minds retained the memories and consciousness of children, albeit children, who had been given years of educational data while they slept. The psychological dissonance was profound and would take months to process, but there was no time for grief or confusion. By the time the first cohort of awakened humans had managed to stand and move, the facility's AI guardians had established priority communication networks. The Kethis expedition was still on the planet. The genetic samples were being prepared for removal. The galaxy was about to learn that Earth was not dead, and Earth's leadership needed to respond. Dr. Amara Hassan, the highest-ranking administrator to wake in the first wave, accessed the facility's communication systems with hands that trembled from more than just the physical effects of suspension. She was 67 years old in terms of the life she had lived, but her body had aged only 18 years since entering hibernation. She felt like a ghost being asked to pilot a living form. "Establish communication with Dr. Kethis," she commanded, her voice rough from disuse. She had not spoken in 318 years. "Prepare secure channels. Do not allow external interception, and get me a full briefing on what has transpired on the surface." The AI Guardian's response came through immediately. The facility's processors had been running, maintaining, calculating for 3 centuries. They had watched the excavation team arrive. They had monitored the removal of genetic samples. They had calculated what it meant. They understood that humanity's legacy was about to be scattered across the galaxy, studied and cataloged by alien scientists who had no context for understanding what they had found. And now, finally, they had permission to wake the sleepers. The message that went out from Earth to the Galactic Archive was not a cry for help or a plea for recognition. It was a statement of fact, transmitted in a secure channel directly to Dr. Kethis's personal communicator. "Dr. Kethis, this is Dr. Amara Hassan, Chief Administrator of Earth's Hibernation Protocol Authority. We are the descendants of humanity. We are alive. Our world was not a tomb but a place of waiting. We understand that you have removed genetic samples from our preservation vault. These samples represent the biological legacy of our civilization. They are not artifacts to be studied. They are repositories of the consciousness and achievement of our people. We request their immediate return. We are not negotiating this point. We are informing you of a fact. The people you excavated for were not dead. They were waiting, and now they are awake." The message was signed simply, Earth. Kethis received the message while examining one of the genetic samples under magnification. The sudden ping of his communicator made him jump, and he nearly dropped the tube. He read the message once, then read it again. Then he began to read it for a third time before realizing his hands were shaking. "We have a situation," he said quietly to Torin, showing him the message. The Vex linguist's compound eyes fixed on the text, processing it with the speed that his species' neural architecture allowed. "That's not possible," Torin said. "There's no evidence of biological activity anywhere on the planet. The seismic sensors haven't detected any." "Read the message again," Kethis interrupted. "They said they were waiting. They said the hibernation protocol. Torin, what if they didn't fail? What if they're still here? The realization spread through the expedition team like a shock wave. They had been walking on a planet full of sleeping humans, millions of them perhaps, all preserved, all waiting. And Dr. Kethis had removed their genetic legacy from its vault. The galaxy exploded into chaos and confusion. News of the message from Earth reached the Galactic Council chambers within minutes. Political debates raged across every network and communication channel within hours. Were these truly humans, or some other species claiming the identity? Could their genetic samples be verified as authentic human DNA? What did it mean for the balance of power in known space if an entire civilization had deliberately gone dormant and was now awakening? Could they be trusted? Were they a threat? The council convened an emergency session that lasted 3 days without conclusion. Faction leaders argued vehemently. The Harmonious Collective, a political group that believed all civilizations should be given equal voice, demanded that Earth be granted immediate recognition. The Sovereignty Alliance, a more militarily focused group, insisted on verification and caution. The Scientific Consortium, predictably, wanted to study the phenomenon before making any declarations. During this debate, Dr. Kethis made a discovery that changed everything. While examining the genetic samples in the archives laboratory, his team ran a full genomic analysis. The results were supposed to be simple: confirm that the samples were human, understand their genetic markers, catalog their biological traits, perhaps discover some explanation for their rapid technological advancement. Instead, the analysis revealed something that should have been impossible. The human genome contained sequences that matched no known species in the archive's database. More than that, the sequences appeared to be artificial insertions, deliberately placed there at some point in human prehistory. Even more troubling, when they cross-referenced these artificial markers against the archive's catalog of known species genetic sequences, they found partial matches in dozens of civilizations throughout known space. Species that had no historical contact with each other, separated by thousands of light years and millions of years of independent development, all carried fragments of the same genetic pattern. The implications were staggering. The data suggested that humans had not evolved naturally on Earth. They suggested that humans had been modified, engineered, or deliberately created by some precursor civilization, so ancient that no current species had any record of it. The so-called seeded species hypothesis, long a subject of academic speculation and fringe theories, suddenly had empirical support. Kethis called an emergency meeting with the Council's Scientific Advisory Board. He presented his findings with meticulous care, explaining the methodology, the cross-references, the statistical likelihood that the patterns were not coincidental. He did not speculate beyond what the data supported, but the implications were clear to everyone in the room. "We may not be looking at a rediscovered species," Kethis said carefully. "We may be looking at evidence of a civilization so ancient that the universe itself has forgotten them, and humanity may be their legacy." The Galactic Council's response was chaos. Some species demanded that humanity be contained, that they be studied under controlled conditions. Others insisted that if humans had ancient connections to precursor races, they might possess knowledge that could be invaluable. Still others expressed existential fear. If there had been civilizations powerful enough to seed entire species across the galaxy, what had happened to them? Were they still out there? And if humans were their legacy, what did that make humanity? Watching this debate unfold from Earth, Dr. Amara Hassan and the newly awakened leadership made a strategic decision. They would not hide. They would not defend themselves against accusations or speculation. They would simply be themselves, and they would let the galaxy see who they were. Earth began broadcasting historical records across every channel that would carry them. Not defensive propaganda, but genuine records of human achievement and human struggle. They broadcast records of human art, music and visual art and literature that spanned the entire span of human civilization. They showed the beauty and diversity of human culture in all its forms. They showed humans creating, laughing, crying, building, thinking, dreaming. They showed their failures too. They showed wars that humans had fought. They showed prejudices and cruelty. They showed mistakes and missteps. They were not attempting to present a false image of perfection. They were presenting truth and trusting that the galaxy could handle it. And they showed their choice. The deliberate decision made by their ancestors 300 years ago to step back from a galaxy that seemed hostile and afraid, to protect their future by sleeping, to preserve their legacy for a time when the galaxy might be ready to accept them as equals rather than as threats or curiosities. The broadcasts were measured, thoughtful, and fundamentally human in a way that no alien species could entirely comprehend. They did not plead. They did not threaten. They simply spoke, and they allowed the galaxy to listen. Weeks passed. Political positions began to shift, slowly at first and then with increasing momentum. The evidence of human antiquity could not be denied. The empirical data from Kethis' analysis had been verified by independent researchers from a dozen different species. The genetic markers were real. The precursor connection was real. Humanity was not a young, primitive species that had somehow achieved rapid technological development. Humanity was a legacy species, one of many seeded across the galaxy by powers no one even remembered anymore. The ethical question of how to treat a recovered civilization became the focus of debate rather than questions of whether they should be permitted to exist at all. The fear did not disappear entirely. Fear of the unknown rarely does. But it became tempered with curiosity, and with a growing sense that the galaxy had just witnessed something profoundly important. Slowly, carefully, the Galactic Council moved toward recognition. Votes were called. Proposals were made. The Harmonious Collective's recommendation for immediate full recognition passed by a narrow margin. The Sovereignty Alliance's amendments for cautious engagement were accepted as reasonable conditions. Within 4 months of Earth's initial message to Kethis, humanity had been granted full sovereign status. The genetic samples that had been removed from Earth were packed carefully and returned to Earth's representatives with formal apologies. But Earth was not finished revealing surprises. Using technology that had been developing throughout the 300-year hibernation, systems that had been running in the deep places, improving and iterating and perfecting, humanity began activating ancient systems throughout their solar system. Satellites that had remained dormant for centuries came online, filling space around Earth with new nodes of communication and observation. Structures buried beneath the surfaces of multiple moons revealed themselves, their purposes initially mysterious to external observers. Communication arrays began transmitting in frequencies that no modern species commonly used. And something else began to emerge. Archaeological records written not in words but in structure, in the very arrangement of matter itself. These discoveries revealed a final truth that changed the galaxy's understanding of itself. Humanity's connection to the ancient seeded species was not recent. It was not a modification made to proto-humans thousands of years ago. The genetic markers had been placed there tens of thousands of years in the past, before humans had even developed agriculture. When humanity was still learning to make fire and developing the first crude tools, the ancient ones had visited Earth. They had left their signature in the very code of human life, not as conquerors or masters, but as gardeners tending to something they hoped would grow. This was not invasion or contamination. This was inheritance. This was a gift that had been waiting for humanity to grow up enough to understand it. Dr. Kethis stood alone in the Galactic Archive's premier research facility, looking at the data that poured in from Earth's revelations, and finally understood what he had awakened. He understood that when he had removed those genetic samples from the vault, he had not been stealing from a dead world. He had been completing a cycle that humanity had begun 300 years ago when they chose to sleep. He had been the instrument by which humanity had chosen to announce its return to the galaxy. He thought about Sarah Chen, the theoretical physicist whose genetic sample he had held in his hands. He wondered if she had volunteered for preservation hoping that someday she would wake, or if she had done it as a sacrifice, understanding that she likely never would. He wondered what she would think if she could see what had become of her legacy, scattered across the galaxy, and then carefully gathered back together. The Galactic Council held its final session regarding humanity without a single vote of dissent. Recognition was unanimous. Earth was no longer a dead world. It was a sovereign civilization with full rights and standing in galactic affairs. Trade agreements were proposed, carefully worded to respect Earth's desire for gradual reintegration. Scientific exchange programs were discussed, with both sides expressing eagerness to share knowledge and understanding. Political alliances were carefully negotiated, with each major faction of the Council seeking to establish positive relations with humanity. But underneath all of this formal diplomacy, every species in known space understood something fundamental. They had discovered that they lived in a galaxy far older and far more complex than they had believed. The universe was not just larger than they knew, it was deeper, more layered, more mysterious. And they had just woken up a civilization that remembered parts of that ancient history that everyone else had forgotten. On Earth, the newly awakened humans looked up at their sky and felt the weight of 300 years of waiting lifting from their shoulders. They had chosen sleep to survive. They had gambled that their legacy would outlast their enemies and their doubts. They had trusted in future generations to find what they had left behind and to understand its meaning. And they had been proven right. Dr. Amara Hassan stood in the Chamber of Records, the central facility where Earth's most critical systems were maintained. Around her, holographic displays showed the expansion of human presence back into space. Ships were being constructed using technology that had been developed during the hibernation period. Scientists were establishing research stations. Diplomats were preparing for first contact missions. The process was slow and careful. Humanity had learned patience if nothing else, but it was inexorable. What do you think they're thinking? Amara asked the AI guardian that had maintained her world through 3 centuries of sleep. The galaxy, I mean, now that we're awake. The AI considered the question in the way that only an intelligence that had contemplated the same data for 300 years could. They are thinking, the guardian said finally, that they do not understand what they have found. They are thinking that they are afraid, and they are thinking that they are fascinated. Are those compatible? Amara asked. Fear and fascination are always compatible, the guardian replied. They are 2 faces of the same recognition, that the universe is larger and stranger than one had previously believed. Amara nodded slowly. She thought about the team that had excavated her world. She thought about Dr. Kethis and his careful scholarship. She thought about the galaxy that had tried to erase humanity's memory and had failed. And she thought about the future that lay before her people. A future that would be written not in sleep but in waking, not in preservation but in creation. The question now was what they would do with their second chance. What a species that had once chosen hibernation to protect itself would do now that the galaxy had recognized them. What a people would build when given the opportunity to shape their own future in the light of day rather than in the darkness of sleep. In the depths of the planet, in the deep places, the hibernation chambers began to cycle down. The last of the sleeping humans were being woken. Some of them emerged to greet a galaxy they had never imagined. Some of them woke to find that their loved ones were gone, lost to the 300-year gap. But all of them woke to the knowledge that they had been worth preserving. That humanity had been worth preserving. The universe did not know what to expect from humanity next. But it was beginning to learn that it had never truly known humanity at all. They had simply been sleeping. And now they were awake, and the galaxy would have to make room for them in a space it had thought was already full. Kethis, reviewing the data from his research vessel one final time before returning to the archive, found himself returning again and again to one particular file. It was the video message from Sarah Chen, recorded 318 years ago, right before she entered hibernation. He had watched it dozens of times, but each time he saw something new in it. "If you're listening to this," the young human woman said, her voice clear and steady despite the uncertainty she must have felt, "then you're probably not human. And I want you to know, we chose this. We chose to sleep, not because we're weak, but because we're strong enough to trust the future." We're strong enough to believe that there will be a future worth waking up to. And if you've found us, if you've brought us back into the light, then you've proven us right." She paused, and for a moment she looked directly at the camera, as if she could see through 300 years and speak directly to Kethis. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for waking us up." The Valentine scientist understood then that he had not discovered an extinct species. He had been the instrument by which that species had chosen to announce its return. He had been selected, by chance or by the inscrutable workings of fate, to play a crucial role in a plan that had been laid out 300 years before he was even born. Everything, the careful preservation, the deliberate warnings, the encoded messages, the hidden technology, had been prepared for this exact moment. Humanity had not been extinct. They had simply been patient. And patience, it seemed, was a trait that ran as deep in human DNA as the ancient genetic markers that predated modern civilization itself. It was written into their very being, a legacy from the ancients who had seeded them so very long ago. And now, as Earth turned its face to the stars and the galaxy turned its face to Earth, the true work of reunion and reconciliation was beginning. What would come next, no one could predict. But one thing was certain: the galaxy would never be quite the same again. Humanity had awakened, and the universe had to make room.